ya, at ya. Tell you what's master, coming at ya, coming at ya. Rhyme style disaster, coming at ya, at ya. Tell you what's master, coming at ya.
Hello, and welcome to In Focus. I am Rom Gayoso, your host. War in continental Europe, millions of people displaced, a continent and a world in crisis. What a shock! But what is it a surprise? In today's show, we're welcoming two very distinguished members of the World Future Studies Federation, WFSF, to discuss the situation in Ukraine. Folks, the future is arriving a lot faster than we think. So let's get going. Before we get started, let's go over the show in focus and why we are here. All righty. So this show is a result of a partnership between WFSF and yours truly, Futures Television. We're joining forces to advance sharing of information and knowledge of futures topics. Our focus is on future studies, foresight, and futures literacy. What should you expect? Well, you will gain direct access to knowledge and information produced by the top minds in this field. WFSF is a UNESCO and UN consultative partner and a truly global NGO with members in over 60 countries. Today, we have two top researchers who will be discussing a very current topic. So, what should you expect to gain from this show? Well, today we discuss some alternatives for the outcome in the war in Ukraine in more detail. The experts will discuss some practical implications of this conflict, and you will know firsthand what they expect will happen in the near future. So before I welcome our guests, don't be shy. The chat windows are indeed open, so feel free to say hi. Okay, so let me say a few words about Dr. Epaminondas Christophilopoulos first. Dr. Christophilopoulos is the Chief Scientific Advisor, Special Secretariat for Strategic Foresight, the Presidency of the Greek government. He is the chairholder of the UNESCO Chair on Futures Research at the Foundation for Research and Technology, Hellas, 4th, and head of Unit of Foresight and Tools at the Praxis Network. So let's welcome Dr. Christophilopoulos to the show. Hi there, how are you doing today?
Hi, Rom. Thank you. I'm perfectly fine. Thank you for inviting me here today.
Thank you for being here. And now I hope I did not do too bad of a job at the introduction. But please, if I miss anything important, could you please say a few words about yourself?
Well, I think you were perfectly right. Actually, this is what I'm doing. Part of my daily life is focusing on the work for the Greek government and the new Secretariat for Strategic Foresight. And then the rest is working for the UNESCO Chair on Futures Research. I'm chairing the chair, and we are working on different projects and, of course, promoting the concept of futures literacy and how we can develop this skill.
Great. So good to have you here. So let's get started. And I would like to talk a little bit about scenarios. So what are scenarios or scenario planning?
Okay, thank you so much. Scenario is maybe the most popular or the most well-known part of our foresight work. In the context of foresight, scenarios are consistent pictures, descriptions, stories about the future. Usually stories that are linked to the present with cause-effect logics. So this is what is about in the field of foresight. But I must say that is only one approach to deal with the future. So it's not everything. Now, the most popular use of Foresight is what we call scenario planning, and is actually using scenarios for building a long-term strategy, for planning ahead. And I guess this is the most well-known use of scenarios today.
Okay, so it seems that really they're used to inform policymakers about futures and futures alternatives or potential alternatives, right? So it seems there's a lot of work involved here. So are scenarios some kind of a panacea? So what are the limitations of scenarios?
I'm really happy that you asking me this, because this is something that after some time in the Foresight business, you realize that scenarios are not a panacea. Indeed, I have the feeling, especially recently, that talking about scenarios is some kind of a hype word, similar to megatrends that everybody is talking about. The main problem, I think, in our community is how we can make scenarios be translated into policy making. And I'm saying this because Foresight is intrinsically related with action. I don't think it makes sense to only imagine the future if you cannot find the way to translate this imagination to action today. So this is a very important thing, and I think one important problem is something that we have to deal in our community. We must find new ways to translate scenarios into policy making. I mean, from the beginning, the production of scenarios was a very useful tool to become more future-proof, to help policymakers to see the future, to feel the future. And I think, and this is what the community is doing today, is trying to find new ways of how we can make these scenarios go into action. And some ways we use is we use serious games, and we put the findings of the scenarios in these serious games. Or I have seen cases creating using virtual reality to create virtual worlds, so participants can experience the futures. But these are only a few ways. I think futures literacy is also addressing this problem. So finding ways to better feel what you read, or understand what are the scenarios about.
Great. So let's change topics a little bit, and let's talk about the current situation in Europe right now. So we're now facing, new global challenges related to the complexity and the impacts of the war in Ukraine. So as we're discussing scenarios, and there's probably very many, right? Are there any scenarios or other foresight studies that actually had foreseen the Russian invasion?
This is something that we are actually addressing right now. And when I'm saying addressing, I mean we are studying in the government to see what kind of scenarios have been out there before for Russia, for Ukraine, and why we didn't pay any attention to these scenarios if those scenarios were successful. So I must say that I have studied in detail at least 6-7 works, and in most of the cases, they have produced really useful scenarios. And in most of these scenarios, they are describing, the researchers, the case of a war or an invasion, I don't know how you prefer to say it, of Russia to Ukraine. Except few cases that the war was not foreseen. I can discuss it why I believe that in these cases the scenario work was not much successful. But in most of the cases, we have seen this possibility to be very clearly described, especially in one work of the National Technical University of Ukraine. Actually, this scenario is actually the most probable scenario. So the people in Ukraine actually were expecting this possibility, and underlying that the government and the country has to pay attention on this scenario. What is also important, because these scenarios are recent. So Russia has already invaded in Crimea and already have annexed some regions of Ukraine. But what is also very important is there were scenarios back in 2009 that actually describing the case of Russia invaded Ukraine. And I'm referring to a scenario produced in Finland in the context of the Finnish Business and Policy Forum in 2009, where in these global scenarios, Russia was invading Ukraine at some point in the future. So the information was there, but probably for some reason, because of the reason we have discussed before, policymakers couldn't visualize and take action based on those scenarios.
So that's an important point to make. Do you think that the inaction was because this is either absurd, or they thought it wasn't likely, even though there was war in the east of Ukraine, or they just thought it wouldn't happen? So what are some of the reasons why you think there was no connection between thought and action?
I believe this is one of the most common problems in Foresight, is how we can make, again, this kind of outcome of our work to alarm policymakers. And I understand that in many cases it's very difficult to take action in advance. So that was also the case here. It was foreseen, or it was perceived by the policymaker as a very low probability event, and probably it was more convenient not to do anything, not to take any action, and do business as usual, which is the easier way to proceed. And this is something that is more something we have to discuss, the Foresight researchers and then the policymakers, how we can make more use of this work.
Okay, so scenarios, or at least the good ones, are accompanied by a good set of indicators, right? So the massing of troops or the mounting of troops in Ukraine's border was probably some indication that some military action would be imminent or fast approaching. I remember the exercises at the border, and then they say, well, we're just passing by, I guess. So what kind of indicators should be looking for going forward?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, indicators is something that can be really useful in a scenario. I have the feeling that it depends when we are producing a scenario, who is going to use it and in which way. So in some cases, indicators might not be relevant. In security scenarios, in most of the cases, because they study too many parameters in a very detailed way, usually it's very easy to take into account some specific indicators that can be an alarm of which way the future is going. In this case, I can refer to a very recent study that was actually produced only a few weeks before the invasion. And it was very useful that they have indicated some specific actions from the Russian side. It was like the movement of troops during the night, where in the previous cases the troops were moving during the day. Some escalation in the rhetoric of Russian policymakers, and especially of President Putin. And also a change in the society, in the Russian society. It proved that all the previous actions from the government, this kind of actions like military invasions, like in Georgia, in Ukraine before, has actually increased the popularity of Putin. So this kind of aspects could be indicators of such a negative scenario.
Yeah, so we're always looking at the scenarios and what to look for next. So are they amassing troops in the border of Poland? Are they doing a friendly exercise near the Baltics? So we don't know exactly, but what kind of indicators we should be looking forward, to see or to at least use to understand. So we have so far focused in Ukraine, right? So let's move from Ukraine into Russia. So what about foresight in Russia proper, right? And the Russian views of the future. So what should we expect going forward?
Actually, this was another thing that we have been following, especially during these days, because that was also a very important indicator of the general feeling, the general strategy of the Russian government. So I'm going to refer to an excellent study, actually, from the European Union Institute for Security Studies. So what they did is actually they studied the Foresight work that has been done in Russia during the last decade. The main takeaways, and that was a very important aspect, is one is that Foresight work in Russia usually have a common agreement on one specific aspect, that the world is changing, and it's changing in a bad way for Russia. So they have this kind of very pessimistic geopolitical view. Another common aspect in the Foresight work in Russia was that there is a lot of focus on the energy field and on defense. And another important thing is that actually what the Foresight work, the outcome of the Foresight work in Russia is actually absorbing what certain thinkers of the Russian political scene are believing about the future of Russia. So what we read in Russian Foresight work is usually the outcome of the thoughts of the big heads in the political system in Russia. So by following this work, we can, in a quite good extent, understand what the Russian political leaders are thinking and maybe what kind of action they would take in the future, as we have seen recently.
So not asking you to read the tea leaves, but we have a situation where the West was fearful of Soviet Union, so we moved troops to the east. And then the Russians, we are fearful of the advancing West, so they moved troops to the West. So do we have some kind of a bad outcome because we are both suspicious of each other, and therefore we will place troops and increase tensions, and therefore kind of our fears materialize into bad policy making, and bad policy making results in, quote, preventive wars, or trying to prevent the other side from winning?
Well, I cannot really foresee what is going to happen in such a short term. I believe that we're gonna have. The operations will end. I don't know how quickly, but rather quickly, I would say. We'll reach some level of stability. But then, what is more important is to see what to discuss what might happen in the longer term future, because all this situation that we are experiencing today will change definitely the future that we have been thinking before. So we will probably see a new Cold War situation that will develop. I don't know for how long, but definitely for some years. So it's going to be a new, very interesting research topic for our field, and especially in Europe.
Now, in terms of Cold War, are we talking about situations where you envision like West Germany and East Germany, so a real partition of Ukraine or split of Ukraine into bits and pieces, half to the west, half to the east, so a two Ukraine or a multi-Ukraine scenario? Is that what we're talking about?
Definitely, these are all very plausible and possible scenarios, and this is not something new. If I refer back to the studies, especially of the Polytechnic University of Kiev, they have very clear descriptions of this kind of possible situations for their own country, actually. So this is something that it was very, very probable. It is now, after all these things have happened, it's the big question is how we didn't see this coming, I mean, in the West. And this is, for me, very important to discuss it internally and see what went wrong between the policymakers in the West.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions in respect to scenario planning proper, right? So first one, Dmitry Ivanov. So considering how many people, structures, experts, NGOs are involved in preparing forecasts, even from the point of view of probability theory, maybe someone should have predicted this to the T. I mean, the specific steps that the Russians made and the lack of action in the West. So was that the case? Was quote somebody right somewhere?
Actually, yes. Although in our field we don't actually look for the perfect forecast, but we accept that it's very almost improbable to foresee the future. But our work is mostly to open the mind to different directions and to different alternative futures. But sometimes, if you are lucky enough, you might actually foresee the one future that is going to happen. So in this case, there were some very interesting cases with this scenario, like the one from the University of Kiev. If we go back from these global scenarios produced in Finland for the Finnish Business and Policy Forum, and also there was another scenario scenario work produced in 2008, 2010. From the Jamestown Foundation, that they have actually also foreseen the invasion of Russia in Ukraine, and they just thought about this because of the previous occupations in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. So they just made the very logical thought that Russia will continue to move in the same direction, occupying different areas of the previous Soviet Union.
Now, kind of a technical question along the same line. So the people who predicted the war, right? Finland and Ukraine. Both countries were already at war at some point in time with either the Soviet Union or with Russia. So part of the outcomes that we believe, are they intrinsically connected with our human experience? So Finland experienced a war in the past, so it thinks a war is possible in the future. Ukraine experienced a war in the past, therefore they think a war is possible or potential in the future.
This is very correct. Our experiences are affecting definitely the way we imagine the future, and definitely people in Ukraine that they have experiencing the situation in the country, the Maidan Square revolution, and what was happening during the last years between Russia and Ukraine probably was much easier for them to foresee the future. I remember another study that we have studied, a study that was organized in Germany for a German party, and they missed completely everything. They didn't find any possibility of a war scenario. If you look closer of how this study was produced, you will find that they have a very small number of experts, most of them Europeans, one or two Russians and one from Ukraine, I believe. So it was very difficult for this small group of people to actually imagine this war scenario. So it's very much related to have a big participatory group to collect ideas and images, and also people that are actually have a very good experience of what is happening in the area.
Okay, so we have a different kind of question still on the technical aspect. So it really is from that Nguyen. And so the challenge is that even that clock or the broken clock could still be correct twice a day, right? So the questions are whether their predicted scenarios are correct, but what's the percentage of correct predicted scenarios versus incorrectly predicted scenarios? So do we have a sense of how much false positive and false negative do these scenarios provide? So if it produces a lot of false positives, then it might be why policymakers don't take it seriously.
Well, actually, this is a key question that we receive very often. If I can say again, we don't try to predict the future. Nobody can predict the future. Whatever tool you are going to use, if you are using artificial intelligence, or if you collect big data and you build models. It has been proven so far that the best way to actually explore the future is to work with different foresight tools and methods and maybe produce scenarios. So the focus is not here to foresee the correct future, but to be prepared for different alternative futures. So this is the way we use scenarios in foresight. We use scenarios to build future-proof strategies, to change our practices today and become more future-proof in order to be more resilient for alternative futures. So this is the basic idea: is not to foresee and be successful, but to be ready and successful in different alternative futures.
Okay, so we have other questions that are associated with perspective. So the first one is, so what did the Russian foresight specialists predict in regards to the Ukraine invasion or the war? So from their point of view, do we have any information what they thought?
Yeah, from what I have read, I haven't read the specific scenarios of war, but the basic feeling, the basic idea is that the world is changing. The world is changing in a bad way for Russia, and we need to take advantage of this and take action, military action, and change. Also, take advantage of how the Western liberal world is, let's say, is not going well. The liberal democracy has the problems. So that was the basic idea in the Russian work of foresight. So I didn't read, at least myself, specific scenarios of how the war is going to evolve. Rom, you are muted.
Sorry. So I want to go back to this question regards to indicators. So this escalation or idea of progression. So after the annexation of Crimea, perhaps should we have expected further escalation or other attempts to annex something else, or a more aggressive warlike potential outcomes?
Yeah, I think we are open to everything. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 was a very big alarm. We didn't hear this. We were sleeping in the West. We took some measures, but those measures were not effective. Were very modest. And what happened afterwards proved that we need to react more aggressively and very clearly show our red lines. So this is what happened now. Yeah, I don't know if I understood correctly the question.
Yeah, so no, the issue was, I guess, was regards to escalation. So if they take the Crimea, then potentially they would take some other parts. So they took the Donbass, and perhaps they would try to take some. Again, the idea was indicators of a potential higher levels.
Well, the escalation is a very probable scenario at the moment. I mean, we don't see at least any other way. Well, I mean, in Ukraine, I'm not talking outside Ukraine, but within Ukraine, what we see and what we read is that Russia will only finalize the operation when they reach their objective, which is probably take all the eastern part of Ukraine, or maybe take all the whole country and put a government that is going to be very friendly to the Russian government. So it remains to see what exactly is the objective. I don't believe anybody has a very clear hypothesis. I don't know anybody knows what Putin is thinking at the moment.
I think the problem is not that we don't know what the end game is, but we suspect that they don't know what their end game is. So I think that's more serious than we don't know. Is I think they might know either. So the next question is about. So this is geopolitical scenarios. So Martin is very intrigued by scenarios, and how to structure uncertainties for decision making. So how could you or how would you adjust or change such political scenarios depending on the audience? So depending on who's hearing the message you're working with. So the policymakers versus the military strategies versus the company leaders, for instance. So how do you change the scenarios according to the audience?
Well, I mean, the methods and the tools producing the scenarios are basically the same, no matter who is the client. Of course, the focus and the description and the language you are using inside the scenario, of course, it can be adjusted to the specific use of the scenario. So, of course, we're gonna focus in different aspects of the future if we are having to discuss a security issue. What is very difficult, I mean, okay, we know the big trends, the mega trends that we can use in our scenarios, but the uncertainties are the more, let's say, critical thing to collect when you are building a scenario, and to identify the critical uncertainties that are going to change and produce the alternative ideas. To select those strategic uncertainties, those critical uncertainties, I would say it's a very tricky process. It takes a lot of experience to understand, and to some extent, you need to is a let's say an interaction between the Foresight practitioners and the participants of the study, of the workshop, because it needs some guidance, all the process, to help them identify the suitable uncertainty so we can construct the alternative images of the future.
Okay, so the next kind of question is about, so is it useful to create scenarios during a fragile period like this? So lots of people are kind of concerned. So this is very grave, right? We're talking about war, people dying, right? So we're not talking about inflation or some hypothetical goal, rather, the taking of human lives and suffering, right? So do we have probability to understand the main scenario that is plausible? So what are you thinking right now? Are you thinking in terms of higher likelihood, less likelihood something will happen?
What Dimitri said is very correct. I wouldn't start a scenario process at the moment. I believe we are now in the middle of a crisis. We are very much affected of what is happening, the images that we are watching on the screen and the news we are reading. So, and still the situation is very dynamic. So any process to produce scenarios at the moment is going to be very much affected from all this experience that we are getting at the moment. I would prefer to initiate a process like this after some months that we have a more stable situation and we can, with cold blood, address this problem and think about the future in a less sentimental way, I would say.
So the other kinds of questions we have are in regards to costs. So we have 2, 3, 4, 10, 20 different scenarios, but even preparing for each and every one of them would be fairly costly. So I have one from that again. So preparing for alternative futures incur costs, right? So we cannot be prepared for all of the scenarios. We can be prepared for a few of them, right? So what kind of ways do you use or would you recommend for us to kind of think about or evaluate the likelihood or how, or more likely or less likely specific scenarios are?
Actually, how we deal with this problem is in a different way, We have this process that is called wind tunneling, and we actually is not actually prepare for one scenario with the more likelihood scenario or the more probable scenario, but actually select strategies and build a long-term strategy that is going to be resilient or successful in most of the alternative scenarios. So this is the way that we actually suggest an organization, a government, a company to work to produce scenarios or a strategy that is going to be resilient in different futures. So this is the way to proceed.
So the other type of question we're getting is in regards to historical precedents or other examples, and people kind of go back to, for example, Shell Oil and their use of scenario planning. So they have been utilizing scenario planning for decades. Actually, Siemens as well, they do like 50-year forecasts, for example. So what about the work? So Shell's work in this area, has it been useful, or is it a useful model for organizations? Why or why not? What are your thoughts on the scenario planning from Shell?
I'm a big fan of the scenario of Shell scenario work. I would say I'm a groupie of the Shell team that actually built this field. And actually, the way that they have started building the scenarios and all the department, the way they have been working is actually still valid today. And I think more or less the strategic foresight community is actually in a great extent is using the same tools. And I would just add one more thing. We are now experiencing an oil crisis, an energy crisis. It was a similar case that happened 3-4 decades ago that actually proved the successful or the value of building scenarios in the Shell's case, because it was the Arab-Israel war that actually produced this energy crisis at that time, and Shell had these scenarios in place and this strategy in place to actually address the problem. So it was actually a very similar situation that we're experiencing today.
Okay, so I wanted to kind of change subjects and ask you a different kind of question. So yesterday was the Sunday of Orthodoxy, and Pascha, the highest or the most important celebration in all of Orthodoxy, is fast approaching. Okay? So this is the time of the year when all Orthodox people actually come together, right? But now there is a war between two predominantly Orthodox countries. So what do you think this war means for Orthodox fellowship and unity, or say lack thereof?
I'm not really an expert on churches, but being in Greece, and I'm of course a Greek Orthodox, as the vast majority of Greeks. So I'm experiencing the situation with Orthodox Church during all my life. So what you are describing is a very important aspect of what is happening, not only recently but for many decades. Actually, I would say for centuries, there is this war between the ecumenical patriarchate in Constantinople and the Russian Orthodox Church based in Moscow, and the Patriarch based in Moscow. So there is this kind of power war, underground power war that is happening for centuries. It was a bit dormant during the Soviet Union times, but during the last decades, this war is still very alive. And we see we see this war in different countries. So different churches are actually either have relationships with the Patriarch in Istanbul or others with the Patriarch in Moscow. In the case of Ukraine, we have two Orthodox churches in Ukraine, one that is following the Patriarch in Moscow, and the other, again, the Ecumenical Patriarch. If you ask me what is going to happen in the future, this political isolation of Russia that we see this coming, I believe it's going to affect also very seriously the Russian Orthodox Church. Already the church in Ukraine is moving away from Moscow, and I believe this is going to be the case also for other Orthodox churches that they had good relations with Moscow. But as I said, I'm not really an expert. I'm just an Orthodox living and experiencing this situation during all my life.
Well, along the same lines, I wanted to ask you a little bit about, and specifically, role of religious leaders, right? So the patriarchs are very influential people. So do you see a role for them? So the Russian patriarch and Bartholomeus, is there a role for them to play in some kind of an effort to bring peace to the region?
Yeah, that would be a very important. Definitely, they can play this role. But the Russian Patriarch so far, it was very has a very vivid position, very strong position supporting the war. So I'm not expecting something serious, a serious effort from that side. That would be a very important situation if we had an independent church that actually supporting peace talks or help the people in Ukraine that are suffering at the moment. I don't know how much power they have, the Patriarch in Istanbul or the Pope in Rome. I believe they could support the process, and maybe this is the time that the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church can move together and take some initiatives to help ease the pain at some point for the people, but also support peace talks. At the moment, we don't see this. We don't. We see some comments from the churches, but we don't see any serious initiatives.
Yeah, that's kind of disturbing, right? Because we expected someone like like Bispo Desmond Tutu to say peace in the world, or the Dalai Lama to say peace, people, peace. So I would have expected the patriarchs to say peace, folks, peace, but it hasn't happened yet. So I have a different kind of question going back to technical aspects, and so Yanis Angel is asking, you mentioned the importance of involving people in participatory foresight processes as more experience-based approaches. What is the status of today in the foresight communities regarding cognitive versus more emotionally driven or metaphorical storytelling approaches?
Yeah, I think today we understand that we need to combine cognitive process and emotions because both of them are part of the way we imagine the future. These are intrinsically connected, and I believe that different teams are exploring different ways to either to combine these processes because they're equally important. I mean, we know this. And sometimes it's not the logic, are the emotions that actually stop us from taking actions in one way or the other. So we need to work in both dimensions.
Okay, so I want to change subjects one more time. And so finally, playing with, or rather changing territorial borders by force is a very dangerous kind of game. So if Ukraine ends up dismembered or partitioned or quartered, what are the implications of that for the continent, say the Balkans, for example?
That was a shock. That was a shock in Europe. Most of the people that are alive in Europe at the moment, we haven't experienced any war. Of course, there was war in Balkans a decade ago, but that was a different case. It was more like an internal war, I would say. So it was not like an invasion. It was, I would say, more like a side effect of the collapse of the Soviet Union and all the communist governments in Eastern Europe. So we haven't seen so far this kind of an invasion in Europe for over 70 years. It was a big shock. It was something that my generation was never expecting to happen. And this is something that is definitely going to change the way we are considering the future. So far, seems like a catalyst for the democratic communities in Europe. People are... I see people that are more aware of we need to take action together, we need to be more active, we need to protect our values and our democracy. So hearing my optimistic side, I would say that not now, because now we are experiencing the very negative impacts of this invasion, but I would say that in midterm future we'll see a very positive impact in Europe on how we use our energy sources, how we invest more on renewable energies, how we cut energy spending and this kind of thing. So I guess or I hope that in medium term we're going to have a very positive impact on the West.
Yeah, so far it's kind of a big challenge, and we see those images, in our TV screen. So it's kind of shocking, but hopefully the horror will be so evident in people's view that we say, well, this is not a very good way to negotiate the future. Perhaps we should find or go back to a different way. Again, since the end of World War II, we haven't seen people trying to change borders by force, right?
Yeah.
Well, it seems we could talk for a lot longer, and I could ask you a lot more questions, and certainly they have many more questions. So we'll save them for another day. Dr. Christophilopoulos, thank you so very much for your being here with me and the audience today. It's really a great opportunity to highlight the work that WFSF members such as yourself do, and how people at large can benefit from all of this knowledge sharing. So thank you so very much.
Thank you, Rom. It was a pleasure, really.
Thank you. So hang around. We'll go back and talk at the end for the final wrap up. So thank you so much. So I will transition a little bit, and I want to talk about my next guest. So Kacper Nosarzewski, he's a partner at Foresight, where he engages UNESCO, all the top 100 companies in Poland, and manages a variety of Foresight projects in Europe and in Africa. He coordinated research for the Polish Society of Future Studies. He's a member, and he taught at Warsaw University. So let's welcome him to the show. Hi, Kacper. How are you doing today?
Hello, Ron. Thanks. Not bad. Hope you're also well.
Well, first of all, Pan Nosarzewski, dziękuję bardzo. Poland is playing a key role in assisting literally millions of displaced Ukrainians. Poland has opened its borders and its heart to refugees who are fleeing the war zone. So not sure where to begin, and thanking you, the Polish people, for all this wonderful and marvelous work you're doing in welcoming so many folks. I believe 2 million now and counting in such a delicate time. So thank you so much.
Well, Rom, I don't feel I'm representing as much as to thank on behalf of all the people who are going way out of normal to help and to bring the kind of assistance they are capable of. And there are so many ways in which help is being delivered, from people who man ambulances and trucks evacuating hospitals in Ukraine and bringing sick people over to and injured over to Poland on trains and on ambulances, but also people who, like there's a guy at the Central Railway Station in Warsaw who is dressed up as a T-Rex, as a dinosaur, and he hands out candies and coloring books to children who are squatting there waiting for the Ukrainian children moving in there, getting off the trains from Ukraine, waiting to be assigned to some shelters and places where they can stay. So just as there are close or already 2 million people seeking refuge, seeking asylum, or fleeing the war, there are perhaps more than 2 million people. There are perhaps more than 2 million ways of helping, and anyone can do it. So I also, before we get into the thick of the things on the scenarios for Ukraine, I also want to encourage everyone who's listening to try and through their local charities or through their community work that they are capable of, to try and assist in this process, because it is, for this part of Europe, unprecedented. Well, we need to take into account that with this number of refugees, this is absolutely comparable scale to Syrian refugees in Turkey or to Venezuelan refugees in Colombia. So we're talking absolute top of the strain and the crisis, humanitarian crisis that it entails.
Yeah, that's right. All of us, we can do a little bit to do our part to help, because it's literally, so there's 2 million in Poland right now, but then thousands or hundreds and thousands in Slovakia, in Hungary, in Romania, in
Moldova,
Moldova.
Romania, yes.
Actually, even in Belarus and Russia, there are thousands of people who are displaced. So we're talking about a displacement of people in the continent that we have not seen since the end of World War II, or since people were welcoming the Syrian refugees. So millions of people, not a few, but rather millions. So before we get started, if I miss anything important, could you please say a few words about yourself and the beautiful work you do at ForCF?
Thank you very much, Rom. Yes, indeed. It's my presence here today also is connected to the fact that my team has worked on the Ukraine crisis and Ukraine war scenarios for various clients, ranging from defense think tanks and security think tanks to all the way to MOD, Ministry of Defense in Poland. And so I've also worked with other clients in national security establishment in other parts of the world too. So since 2014, since before the invasion and annexation of Crimea, we've been looking through scenario processes, through simulations, through war games, and through different workshops and reports at how this situation could spell out, but also at the consequences, political and strategic consequences for the EU, for the region, and for the also on a bigger scale everywhere in the world, because the global balance of powers is affected when Russian Federation takes such a move, and this is why it has global reverberations, not only for humanitarian concerns. ForCF is a team of Foresight specialists. And we've been in the business for 15 years already. I'm here for 10 years. So there were, like you said, many clients and many different projects, but it's always a difficult moment also emotionally when you see the processes, the projects that you did, the foresights that you developed for such tragic events like the war that's happening in Ukraine following the escalation of Russian aggression, bearing in mind that Russia is present militarily on the Ukrainian territory since 2014 in Crimea, in Donbass, and in Lugansk. So to see it in real life is a testing moment also for Foresight or future studies experts.
Well, it's one thing to imagine it. It's the other thing to see it unfold in front of our own eyes, especially the more drastic or more impactful scenarios such as a war or escalation of violence. Now, I wanted to remain in the topic. So you worked on a variety of scenarios for Ukraine. So not just 1, 2, or 3, but actually several. So let's talk about the near future. What outcomes can be anticipated for the war in Ukraine?
I need to second what Nondas said a couple of minutes ago concerning the difficulty of doing foresight when we are in the thick of the things, where there's so much happening. There's fog of war that prevents us from seeing the developments on a tactical level in Ukraine, from understanding in specific places who's winning and who's losing, and both sides apply a strategic communication and measures to transfer a certain narrative of the events. So it definitely doesn't help in imagining the future for Ukraine. But still, based on the work that we did, and also on some of the projects that Nondas Christophilopoulos referred to, we can start to try and, in very broad strokes, sketch out what could be the outcomes. Nondas, and we can talk about them in, let's say, 3 portfolios, in three different kinds of flavors. Calling them scenarios wouldn't be too accurate at this point, but we might just as well say there are 3 sets of scenarios for Ukraine. The one that seems to be with every passing day of violence, with the mounting attrition, with mounting casualties, also civilian, but also with a sort of a stalemate that we are witnessing in Ukraine, especially in terms of this becoming a very archaic war, a very unmodern sort of war, not a maneuver war, but a position war, not maneuver warfare, but position warfare. We are slowly but surely transitioning into what can be called a marathon, a scenario for the future in Ukraine where I would even go beyond what Nondas said. Not in a matter of weeks will this conflict be resolved, but it could take months and even longer of ambiguous situation in which there may be places where there is ceasefire, but there is no truce anywhere and there is no peace in sight, which means that we could witness in this marathon scenario a formation of new separatist quasi-republics, like we've already seen in Donetsk and Luhansk. The same thing could happen in other major cities in eastern Ukraine, and this, of course, is a part of fait accompli of de facto policy, strategic policy of Russian Federation there to create, even if ambiguous, even if contested, but create some political facts that will hinder the possibility to restore peace or just restore stability as it was in 2021, or even better as it was pre-Crimea, so in 2013, in terms of territorial integrity of Ukraine. This scenario of marathon, this scenario of long run, is very strenuous also for the West, because the longer a crisis lasts, the more the will to fight, the morale on business side, and the morale in terms of we've seen so many announcements of American and European businesses pulling out of Russia, renouncing their cutting off their business ties with the Russian Federation. But this, the will to do this, if this conflict is extended in time, will falter, and we will see many centrifugal forces within important Western countries that will contest the commitment that was initially made, the full and unambiguous commitment to democracy and sovereignty in Ukraine. So this is a scenario that where there are many ambiguities and there are many moving parts, but this is one that is, with every day of fighting, gains in importance. It's also the most the murkiest, the most opaque, in which really things could go in different ways, but no way is good. Could it culminate in a sort of a new Cold War setup where we would have two states on two banks of Dnieper River in Ukraine? I don't think this can be completely ruled out as a possibility, as the whole world is watching, and the whole world wants this to end. Only different actors want the war in Ukraine to end in different results. So this is the scenario that I think is the most intricate, but also the most intriguing, and the one to which we need to pay the most attention. Also the hardest to work with from a Foresight perspective. There are other two, and I can go right into them unless you want to ask some follow-up question on the marathon, the long run scenario.
Yes, in terms of the marathon, so before you depart, I wanted to ask you a historical question, specifically in regards to Polish history and the Polish experience. So during World War II, the Germans wanted a buffer between them and the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union wanted a buffer between them and Germany. So both invaded Poland, the Germans from the west and the Russians from the east, or the Soviets from the east, and they partitioned Poland. So and again, part of the drama we experience is we don't know what is the end game, or what is it that the Russians want at the end of the day. So are we back to that kind of the philosophy in terms of geopolitical strategies? The Russians want a buffer zone between them and the NATO forces? Is that what's going on? Or one potential explanation?
Yeah, well, I would not completely disregard ways of explaining and making sense of war in Ukraine from a Russian perspective. It's very important to understand, and this is why I also think it's Nondas should be thanked for trying to dig into the Russian perspective on futures and geopolitical futures. The historical comparison is not so easy to apply, because there is no Western invader here that could be interested in territorial gain from Ukraine, and there is, well, NATO or Germany or Poland or no one else wants to profit from this war, like the Soviet Union did in following a secret treaty with the Nazi Germany in 1949, which effectively partitioned Poland. So at the just like you said, at the beginning of World War II, after the German invasion of Poland, Soviet Union invaded from the east, and they divided the country between themselves, not creating a buffer zone, quite to the contrary, standing face to face. And in 1941, this of course changed when Hitler invaded Soviet Union. But so this analogy cannot be directly used, and like many historical analogies, it can be misleading in when you're thinking about what the future holds. But if we are inquiring about the Russian perspective on this, we can see across ideological writings, philosophical or historiosophical writings of Russian elite thinkers in the last 20 or 30 years, what concept they are trying to explain, and how they want to what substance they want to put to support their imperialist policy in that leads to using war as a means of policy in Ukraine here and now. So here, of course, there are claims of protecting security from NATO as the adversary. There are claims of, but there are also deeper running cultural threads, such as the Kievan Rus being the cradle of the statedom and statehood in this part of Europe, and also an independent country and an important religious and cultural hub at the times when Moscow was still ruled by the Mongols. So there is, of course, this idea that only a unification or federalization of all the former Soviet Union territories restores the historical balance and restores the right, sets the right tone for the future, because the situation here and now is just a historical error. This is the kind of narrative that Russia is putting forward. But we should always, and I'm saying this in personal capacity, and I don't want this to be ascribed to a World Future Studies Federation or anyone else, but we need to understand that the Russian political system is based on a nexus of organized crime and ex-KGB and oligarchic, corrupted business models. So the ideological grounds are there to justify the means and goals that have much more basic and much more simple motivation, just like staying in power, protecting those who profit from the present system, and somehow nurturing and deeply undemocratic and a very problematic political concept for statehood and for a society, one that is that we see play out in Russia over the last at least 20 years after the collapse of the idea for a more democratic and more liberal Russia in the 90s, post and also following the collapse of USSR. So it's important to learn about this, but also it's important to know to which set of values we subscribe. Values are an important part of futures process, and we often question and challenge the assumptions about the future that we make based on values that we subscribe to, or at least that we declare. that we pledge allegiance to. And as much as I am, this is part and parcel of Foresight business to question and challenge the assumptions, also the assumptions stemming from values, and leaving no stone unturned in the quest for, inventing new futures, ones that enable that help us imagine in a more rich and more a future that is just somehow emancipates us from the past limitations. I wouldn't say that we should only question for questioning's sake, and there is always a limit at which we need to stop, because if we revert the values that we subscribe to, of liberty, of democracy, of self-determination, and so on, then this is not where it should go. And I see this kind of uncertainty and ambiguity about the situation from people who try to understand both sides and sometimes end up not understanding any of either of them.
So you mentioned the restoration of the Soviet Union as a potential way for the future. That's kind of dangerous and kind of scary at the same time. But I wanted to ask you, so one of the important things we do, and I think in all futures exercises, is to include all voices. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about, to the extent possible, that we can discuss the Russian perspective. So let's go back 20 years. We had President Yanukovych, who was really a person on the wall, at times appeasing the Russians, at times dealing with Western Europe. But he was overthrown. Actually, former President Yanukovych is in exile in Russia proper. So to what extent do you believe, so not so much as restoring the Soviet Union, but the view or perspective of bringing back a friend that was overthrown by the expansionist West, so quote, restoring our good friends in Ukraine to their historical truth and their quote legitimately elected president that was overthrown and it's now sitting in Moscow?
Yeah, well, I don't want to sound too smart on this, but it's fairly easy to say that if you need to, invade the country to liberate it, well, we've seen many examples both in the East and in the West of excuses being made to justify more basic and more easy to understand motivations. And I want to imagine and go deeper into the imagination of future of Russia that we see, because it's not only the longing for the USSR. There are other motives here as well, other tropes. There is within the Russian Federation political elite, there's also longing for pre-revolutionary Russia, so to the Tsarist Russia. And it's not just declaratory. We've seen it, and it's been described by journalists how the Russian elites tried to retie connections with the so-called White Russian successors, White Russian descendants, the families of aristocratic or wealthy families who fled Russia in 1917 in the revolution or in the years subsequent, and try to create something that will not just mimic USSR with all the problems, like economic problems and economic predicaments of a communist or aspiring communist economy, but also create a sort of a new value, a sort of a new quality, an emergent future for Russia that would take the best from the USSR in terms of the extent of territorial, the extent of the empire and the military might as a nuclear superpower, but also this tradition that comes with philosophical and political foundations that go deeper, that go hundreds years back. With the Romanov family, so the dynasty that ruled Russia ever since in 17th century, the so-called period of troubles in Russia concluded. The period of troubles that meant that the statehood was at risk because the previous dynasty died out, and there were civil wars, but also interventions from neighboring countries. So when we're thinking about the future, and this is, I think, an important memento from a futurist perspective in this specific conversation, that we know this, but we should be telling this to people. We cannot seek direct analogies and try, in a sort of macro historical perspective, see the future as repetition of the past. Just look for the cycles and say every 80 years there's a major war in Europe, so this is part of some kind of a bigger historiosophical or macro historical plan, and this is part of some kind of sinusoid between positive and negative, or whatever polarities you ascribe to this. We should be always we should always be considering that there may be an emergent risk coming from this. So, because if we just say that this is Russia restoring its historical security buffers, that it means, what the assumption behind this, we know the limits of the historic buffers geographically, be it Vistula River or Oder, or further, in the old German Democratic Republic, perhaps the West-East Germany border. But, it limits our thinking in taking imperialism for what it is, that it's always insatiable, that it's always hungry for more, because its imperialism is imbalanced as and aggressive as by definition. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't make these analogies, but completely. But we should always consider that this time around, it may not just be the repetition of what we know from history books. It may be something much more sinister, something profoundly more, a much bigger threat to the global balance of power and to the European and to the values to which European societies in the EU subscribe, that are embodied in the Charter of Fundamental Rights, European Charter of Fundamental Rights, and others. And if we like the progressive turns and progressive strengths in policy, we should completely, we should clearly say that the Russian Federation policies, both internal and external, are overtly hostile to whatever we consider good and just in diversity, in inclusiveness, in democracy, in fairness, and so on. I'm afraid I'm painting a bit of a dark picture of Russian Federation, and I don't want to play on the present emotion, but this can be analyzed also, in cold blood and from a cool perspective, and the results would not be much different.
I kind of like the comparison you made. So from their perspective, so let's go back not to the Soviet Union, but to Imperial Russia. So Katarina the Great, Peter the Great. So perhaps they have a romantic view of the future, going back to the past with a great Russia, and they themselves don't see themselves as the robber barons or the oligarchs, but they're actually the new boyars who are helping rebuild the great Russia. So perhaps in their view, they are doing, quote, what is right.
Yeah, of course. So, well, it can be said so, and we know we have eyewitness accounts and we have documentation proving that Putin's circle for many years already, first in St. Petersburg and now in the famous Putin's palace on the Black Sea, have made historical reenactments of court life at the court of the Tsars. Dressing up in fancy gowns and historical costume and trying to relive the feeling of being on top, also from a more perennial perspective, not just the lifespan of an individual, but something bigger, something greater. the conversation we're having about this should however, I want to rebalance this a little bit, because I'm coming from Poland, a country that has been for centuries contested and that's confronted the different emanations of Muscovite rules and different political formations that existed in the East. And also I want to refer to the fate of Ukrainian or Belarusian or the nations of the Baltic states, the societies of the Baltic states. It's interesting to talk about this in terms of the ideas of the West and the ideas of the East. The futures imagined for the future of Russia, or the futures imagined by the West. But we should perhaps try, and this is not easy, to keep the perspective of those who've been excluded from the conversation about what it means, or if they were even part of the conversation about the future in 19th century or in 20th century, they had a sort of a lesser place at the table or they did not have the statehood at a given moment, or just the conversation was going over our heads, like in Yalta in 1943. So I take great pride in the possibility to publish. Well, we've published at the Polish Society for Future Studies 2 days ago a reflection piece on the situation in the Ukraine war by a Ukrainian foresighter from Technical University of Lviv, Petro Suchorolski, who is also a member of World Future Studies Federation, by the way, who's presenting his perspective. And when you shift the lens, as we often do in future studies, when you shift the lens from considering the futures that Russia wants or the futures that the West wants, and you try to capture the reality and the values that this so-called small nations of Central and Eastern Europe, is being already, isn't it a bit derogatory in term? That they also have a right to some kind of future, and they also have a right to make sense of complexity of political, economic, and social dilemmas in their own way. Then you realize, well, it's we shouldn't be defined, and nobody's future should be defined by political visions of any empire. And I think this is something that resonates quite well with many people who are listening to us in the United States, just as much as it is resonating with people all around the world who feel that they are not, for the moment or never been on the privileged group, on the group that dictates the theory, the historical or future theory that tells us, what is normal, tells us what is what is homeostatic in terms of balance of powers, when the energies and the potentials are well balanced. Well, ask those who are at that at the impact zone of this, and then they will tell you that we don't want this to be decided for us,
them,
for them, or especially for them, because we can't quite compare situation in Poland with Ukraine, not at all at the moment. For them, decided by somebody else based on regardless if you want to quote Hannah Arendt or I don't know. Adorno or Immanuel Kant, you can use many great quoting, but we shouldn't lose from sight from philosophical theories and historiographical theories, the fate and the livelihood of actual people who live in the region and who experience the war locally, and what future they have in front of them. In the marathon scenario that we've just discussed, well, the future is no foreign direct investment, problems in subsistence because of just cut supply lines, maybe injury, maybe definitely mourning, likely death. So underneath the sheen of the sheen of diamonds in Fabergé eggs and this conversation about the balance of powers and so on, there are fates of individual people who live in what has been called by a famous Yale historian, Timothy Snyder, the bloodlands. This part of Europe that in 20th century experienced loss of life of tens of millions of people who've been slaughtered, murdered here. And when we see, war atrocities happening here and now, it also influences. This should also be taken into account as local and visceral perception of what is happening, but also a different set of lenses that we use to look at the futures.
Now, I wanted to remain at the historical questions for a minute longer. So, one of the arguments that the Russians use is, it's a plane all the way from Poland into Moscow, right? So, Napoleon came through the plane, Hitler came through the plane. So, there's this, maybe it's just an argument, historical fear that maybe a horde of Westerners will go through the plane and get to Moscow. But nowadays we have nuclear weapons. So to what extent this is a real fear in their part, or is just a plot? I mean, if the West were to invade, let's say the Polish decides to march into Moscow, right? They would use a nuclear weapon, right? So to what extent is just hula baloo, or they're just using it as a historical revisionism to justify? Or do you think it's real? They really truly fear that, in some point in time, the West will march in or barge in?
Yes, this is always the temptation to look at futures through the perspective of geography book but then it can be very easily reverted. If you consider and this is something that geostrategists or geopolitical experts like to do, if you look at the sheer mass of the Russian interior, so the Eurasian span of this country, and if you look at the scale of the small peninsula that is Europe, with Iberian and peninsula of Italy, with some small islands, Britain, Ireland, Scandinavian peninsula, it's really it's dwarfed by the monstrous size and scale of Asia, even though of course many maps lie to the actual proportions, because if you look at the globe you will see that Africa is much bigger than as a continent and considerably bigger in size than we're used to perceive it to be perceiving it. So this can be reverted. You could also say in a similar manner that from Moscow across the plains in Smolensk, Warsaw, further to the west across Greater Poland through Poznań, Berlin, and there are Harz mountains somewhere along the way, but you could go all the way to Pyrenees without crossing any major mountain chains. So maybe people who are now enjoying the drinks in Biarritz on the Basque coast of France could be just as terrorized or anxious about their future as hypothetical Russian leaders could be in their bunkers in Moscow or in the Urals. So if you look at this from different perspective, it's all the same. But for some reason, and the reason is political, and the reason is in the sort of deal and the ideals that the societies embrace, people, I don't see much preaching in terms of Russian threat at the Basque Riviera of France or on Côte d'Azur, and I see much of this rhetoric being used by the other side. So maybe to restore a bit of balance, it works both ways. A plane can be traversed by a backpacker going around to see the world and meet new people, but it can be very, very quickly run over with tanks. And what you're saying as well about the nuclear powers is it's a way to balance out the situation, of course, that there is no real threat. Well, I don't see any real threat of any NATO country having any territorial claims against Russian Federation and moving, into Russia. So nothing to be afraid. There are other problems.
They know they took Karelia from Finland in a war, and they took Königsberg from Germany in the war. So they fear that in the end of the day or sometime in the future, they say, wait a second, this used to be ours, now give it back. So lots of people are concerned with the issue of an expanding war, also because we don't know what the end game really is. So one kind of question is, so looking at the EU strategic compass and the end 2030, so what is the future scenario for Ukraine and neighboring countries? So the possibility of, so lots of people are asking about the spillover effect. So what will be the position of Russia in your perspective, and also of Poland? So implications of neighboring, so Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, so Bessarabia, Poland.
Thanks for this question. Of course, this is very relevant, and it's important that it's being asked because the present war makes us redraw and reconsider some of the concepts and what we considered in terms of scenarios or futures for Europe, what we considered plausible or what we considered realistic. Under the marathon scenario, the one that we've been discussing so far, it's well, you could say that it doesn't really tip the scales in any direction because it's still we're trying to rebalance or have peace in a present geopolitical setup. But if this war is won by either of the parties, either of the sides in the next month or two, which means expulsion of Russian Federation forces from Ukraine by the Ukraine armed forces, or to the other end, Ukrainians being overrun by Russians, the present government being overthrown, some kind of puppet regime being installed, and the usual elements of policy for occupied country, perhaps further the fragmentation with new people's republics in the eastern. Well, these scenarios present give opportunities and threats for European and Russian foreign policy and for the balance of powers. So for definitely there's no doubt about it that once the hostilities end, it's not irrelevant which side wins, even though Ukraine is outside of the EU, because the reconstruction of the country will be only possible on in terms that are acceptable to the West if the Russians pull out, and this presents an incredible, a lovely set of opportunities for further development and for rebuilding and strengthening of the European project. On the other hand, if the Russians prevail in Ukraine now, there will also be a reconstruction, but it will be done by maybe Chinese companies, maybe Russian, Sino-Russian companies, maybe some other partners of Russia who have unfaltering support for their cause and who have a strong popular, even strong popular support for Russian imperialism. And I could mention as an example, not a perfect one, as we all know, it's much more complex in the specifics, but countries like India. So the reconstruction of Ukraine after the war is something, is a topic which can be actually considered when we're looking at the end game and when we're looking at realignment or corrections in EU policy. The meaning of Eastern Partnership and the meaning of the neighborhood policy as it evolved over will be reshaped one more time. And we can clearly see that it could be reshaped to a more beneficial, a stronger, ever stronger union, or it can be used to contest the European project and install other agents and other actors in the region.
Okay, I have different kinds of comments. So one, a man with big heart, Professor Klaus Solberg-Soilin, I know him. So he says we have a refugee family living in our home now. And that fills me with much joy during this difficult period. Sitting at the table with Misha, who's 2 years old, whose house in Kharkiv was bombed. Well, now we know the west of Ukraine is being bombed as well, right? So a couple of questions. So one is more general. So is there a danger when experts talk rationally about finding a, quote, solution to the Ukraine crisis? Does this not risk giving legitimacy to the attacker?
Well, and the further part of this question is just equally interesting, because by saying, okay, we need to give Russia a chance to get out of this and for Putin to save his face in this situation, we're saying we're sort of accepting the fait accompli, the de facto policy of Russia that has been described as a policy of escalating to de-escalate. So making 2 steps forward so that we can make 1 step back, but still be on the winning side, still have more gain than we've lost, or that we decide to give up of the spoils that we've gathered. So it's different when we're looking for a rational solution from a perspective of what is called in Germany Russlandversteher. So people who claim to understand Russia and the legitimacy of its policy. And it's different when we're trying to look at this in a rational way by imagining the possible consequences and first degree, second degree, third degree consequences of the situation here and now. The former doesn't help much, although it has it's also, there's also place at the table for people who want to advocate for Russia's interest here. We can agree to disagree, or we can go more violent about this, but I'm not saying we should gag anyone. And the latter situation in which we are still trying, even though the bombs are falling, even the towns are being shelled, maternity wards being evacuated under artillery fire in Mariupol 2 days ago, that we should still try and use the rational and intellectual categories we have at our disposal as futures literacy says, use this different ways of using the future, different ways of imagining the future, more rational, more emotional, more spiritual, more materialistic, more political, or more anarchistic. And they all have a place in thinking about the futures of Ukraine also, but we also shouldn't discard completely the role that, tactical operational ways of imagining the future have, and just the fact that parts of the West have been preparing for this war for the last 7 years already, and looking at this, and I've also been part of this with our work on war scenarios in Ukraine, imagining what could happen, not to provoke it, not to make it happen, not to throw matches at gasoline tanks. No, absolutely no matches allowed, but to be able to embrace the situation and not be overwhelmed by it, but be able to dive into this chaos and save what can be saved.
Now, you mentioned Russlandversteher, right? So talking about your neighbors to the west now. So since Willy Brandt and since the 1960s, Germany invested in this Horst politic, right? Rapprochement with the then Soviet Union, and it really played a key role. So Chancellor Helmut Kohl was able to negotiate the reunification of Germany, extracted out of the Soviet Union. Now, the new Chancellor Scholz, actually did a 360-degree turnaround, right? So instead of rapprochement with Russia, they're saying, well, we need to take a different stance. So to what extent do you believe this is going to be the policy going forward? So no longer rapprochement, but rather more escalation.
As many of people who listen to our conversation know, the project for energy transition in Europe was to a big extent based on natural gas as a fuel, and this was an apex, a culmination of the process that you've talked about. The assumption that if we do good business with Russians, we may actually end up not fighting each other because it's not good business. it would be cool to hear German experts have a say on this, because as much as I don't want someone else to be talking over my head, I don't want to be creating German futures for the German experts, and give them all due respect in this. If I was to forecast something, yes, I believe that the pivotal moment was in the second or third day of the war, when Germany actually reverted course and started, contributing aid to Ukraine. Believe with what I imagine as the assumption or the stimulus for this, imagining that it's possible to still do business with Russia, but with someone else on the Kremlin. That this is possible. That this is a possible endgame of this war, and this would not be a panacea to anything, but this is a future that we, have the right to consider. That Russia, yes, maybe in a different political setup, that the Russian society will be able to decide upon in a more democratic manner.
Wonderful. So let me bring Dr. Christophilopoulos back on, and kind of going into our final thoughts, or your final thoughts. So one way is you described a marathon, a long and protracted conflict in Ukraine. So I want to ask both of you this question. So what kind of potential outcomes you see for the near future? So 5 to 10 years. So protracted conflict, marathon is one of them. Can you name a couple more that you would see, both of you? So maybe starting with Dr. Christophilopoulos, do you see other potential outcomes?
Well, I mean, I guess in this kind of things you can think about many different variations. Some of them are, I mean, I can think very quickly, maybe 10 of them. I think the important thing here is what Kacper said just a few seconds ago. It's very important to reconsider our assumptions and how we consider things on the future, because that was the basic mistake we did in Europe during the last decade. We focused on a very wrong assumption of how is going to be our relationship with Russia, and we took for granted some how Russia and Putin will react and behave, let's say, in the future. And that was completely wrong. So I think the important thing is to think about all these alternatives and reconsider our assumptions, because thinking that Russia will react the way we expect, or the Russian society will react the way we expect, is basically wrong. It's a false assumption.
Yes, I absolutely concur with Nondas that this is the never-ending vocation of futurists, to be helping in being the midwives or mid-husband of the birth of new assumptions and questioning of the old assumptions. There are some short to midterm effects that we will likely witness. Of course, inflation has been rampant in Europe for the last year already, so we shouldn't expect this to change in the short term. So if inflation is above 10%, well, to put this into perspective, that means that people are getting 10 months pay for 10.5 months pay for 1 year of worth of their work. Another thing is the energy conundrum, and I've already touched upon this. It merits a separate discussion. I also agree here with Nondas that this is a huge opportunity for speeding up the process of decarbonization and moving toward a greener and more digital economy, because in a world where you have your own solar cells, I'm oversimplifying it in a vulgar way, but in a world where everybody has their own solar cells, the oligopolies of energy companies and the monopolies of fuel and coal, gas, or uranium or petroleum providers cannot dictate political political solutions in a way that we've seen in the last decades. And the third thing is, of course, and this is very sad, although I've worked with the arms industry, with European and other companies, and I've seen how, there's a huge amount of innovation and good work being done in terms of new defense systems and so on. We need to understand that if 100 billion euros is being moved in Germany toward defense, and if important adjustments and appropriations would be made in budgets of every country in the world following this, it means that money will not land somewhere else, because there is no magic money that just comes from the thin air. Can be printed, but it also has a cost. So important social goals, important political goals, important things that are close to our hearts may be defunded or just not receive sufficient attention, because money will be moved over to defense budgets, to buying guns and ships and planes and investing in these technologies. So these are the consequences we need to face. One more thing, the last one, for the region, Central and Eastern Europe, one of the biggest threats here is, of course, perception of risk. So if perception of risk changes, but it also affects the countries that are south from Romania, Bulgaria and Greece to some extent. If we see an increase in political risk because of the external risk of escalation from the Russian Federation, foreign direct investments are likely to go down, and all kinds of measures that are being used to secure these investments that are by their own nature inefficient. Because they decrease efficiency in favor of security considerations. This is also not good business to the societies of Greece, Bulgaria, Poland, the Balkans, Turkey, and other countries that are, by an incident of history, a little closer to Russia or to the old East than those that have the capital to invest.
Well, right, it seems that we covered quite a lot of ground today. Pan Nosarzewski, dear Koibartso, thank you so much again for your time today. Dr. Christophilopoulos, thank you so much for your time today and sharing your thoughts again, folks. Two distinguished members of WFSF sharing their views and their work. And in some current situation, and we tend to think about we're talking about the future. The future is already happening. It's happening today. Borders are being changed by thoughts. As Kacper mentioned, now money will be diverted away from social projects and certainly from climate change. And specifically for Greece, was devastated by huge fires not too long ago. Now all those reconstruction projects will be put into the back burner for a while as we make more guns and less butter, I believe. Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Ron. Thanks for hosting me, and thanks, Nondas, for also being here today, and for your comments. It was a huge pleasure to talk to you, although the topics are unpleasant and the futures ahead of us, with copious amounts of futures literacy that we may cultivate. They don't only inspire faith, and they don't only inspire hope.
Yeah, also from my side, thank you, Kacper. Thank you, Rom. I would just one more thing. What is happening now, I believe, is just a mistake in human history. Human history shows that we are improving the way we are living, and we are improving the situation for humanity. So I believe in if we look back in a decade or in 2 decades, we'll see that was actually a catalyst for a positive development in Europe and in the world. I think that will be the way we're gonna look at these events in the future.
That's the work of futurists. We'll find out a way of the positive out of all those challenges, and Europe will emerge stronger and better, I'm certain.
Yeah. Let's hope.
Well, again, thank you so much, folks. It's time for us to start wrapping up. So please stay tuned. This show in focus will be broadcasted via Futures Television, our home of the future on television, coming soon on Roku TV. is going to be available freely via the Roku stick or Roku-enabled TV sets. So start looking for Futures Television and do add us to our list of preferred channels. So I hope to see you again soon in another episode of In Focus. You can rest assured we have lots of great guests ready to share their views with you. And I will leave you with our institutional message. Thank you.